actually, it seems like Hamas is ready and willing to relinquish control of the Gaza Strip, and that Israel keeps on adding back the stipulation that Hamas remain. What? This is bad. And but also really, really fascinating. I want to let's just look at this article before we dig into that. But now, why would they want to keep Hamas in power? Because that's the whole basis for the genocide. That's why they can do the ethnic cleansing, is to say they're getting rid of Hamas. If Hamas says we're giving up all political power, in fact, even if the news that Hamas is willing to give up political power breaks, that punctures their entire modus operandi. That's their entire propaganda, their entire lie that Hamas is unwilling to relinquish power. And, that's why they have to keep killing babies and shooting people who are seeking aid, as they did the other day, which felt kind of like an entrapment moment of luring people again with food and then killing them. So this is from Scahill from a couple days ago, how Israel and Witkoff are trying to strong arm Hamas into a deal that does not end the genocide. And it's sort of a point-by-point breakdown of how the U.S. and Israel changed the deal Hamas said it made with Trump's envoy. So if you guys remember that, there's Witkoff, by the way, and there's Netanyahu. If you guys remember, Witkoff and Hamas had originally met, and they had agreed to some points of agreement, or they had agreed to a ceasefire, basically, and then Witkoff met separately with Israel, and then they're spitting back at Hamas something completely different. On May 25th, Palestinian negotiators from Hamas believed they were on the verge of a deal to end the genocide. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, Hamas was told, had approved a term sheet that reflected Hamas's major demands and indicated the Trump administration would work to have Israel accept them. But less than a week later, Witkoff came back with a dramatically altered version crafted with Israel that did not explicitly guarantee key provisions for ending Israel's war or the withdrawal of its forces. This new agreement made between Israel and the U.S. was subsequently touted in the press as Trump's plan to end the war on Gaza, and the onus was now on Hamas to accept it. Yesterday, Dropsite published a full version of the term sheet crafted by Israel and the U.S. Today, we're publishing the May 25th version agreed to by Hamas. And then they're sort of like, comparing and contrasting it. The terms provisionally agreed to by Hamas largely returned to a previous ceasefire deal signed on January 17th that was, as we remember, violated unilaterally by Israel in March, meaning a major withdrawal of Israeli forces, the delivery of hundreds of trucks a day of food, medicine, fuel, and other aid. The agreement would also mandate that Hamas give up governing power in Gaza. An independent Palestinian committee would be created to take charge, and reconstruction would begin immediately. Most significantly, the U.S. would guarantee that a ceasefire would be held and the delivery of aid uninterrupted until a long-term resolution to the war was in place. The United States and the mediators commit to ensuring the continuation of negotiations, maintaining a cessation of hostilities, and the entry of aid until a permanent ceasefire is reached, Hamas's term sheet says. In the Israeli version, that guarantee is completely gone, replaced by a U.S.-backed ceasefire only during the 60-day period of proposed agreement. So key differences they break down. This is excellent. The duration of the ceasefire, Hamas agreed to a 90-day ceasefire, and then Hamas initially proposed a 90-day ceasefire. Then it said it would accept a 70-day version, and later signaled a willingness to accept a 60-day truce with a clear path to extend the truce as long as negotiations continued. What the U.S. and Israel crafted was a 60-day ceasefire with no automatic extensions. Talks in the truce may only continue if both sides agree and are negotiating in good faith. So it's basically the same amount of days, but one of them says it's 2 months of respite. And then one of them says, we'll have a path to continue the truce. And the other one's like, nah, only if we think you're negotiating in faith. And remember, the reason that they broke the ceasefire last time is because they didn't think that Israel said Hamas wasn't acting in good faith, I believe, surrounding some amount of aid they were receiving. And again, remember that the kinds of aid that they are not okay with, we've seen them reject things like chocolate croissants, because, of course, they're delicious and wonderful, and any apartheid state would probably be against them. But also, we've seen them, break ceasefires and agreements because there were building materials that were being transported into Gaza. And remember, if you're trying to ethnically cleanse people and move them out, you don't want building materials because that shows that you might rebuild. you might 80%, what is it? God, I can't believe it's just 80% of the buildings in Gaza have been leveled. What Hamas agreed to is that Trump would personally guarantee the ceasefire and commit to enforcing it. Does that mean he's like physically there? Because I would love that Trump was like, no, stop. Like very, very Parker Posey coded, like, I'm going to personally agree to it. I'm going to send myself there. What the U.S. and Israel crafted is that Trump is mentioned as announcing the agreement, and the president guarantees Israel's adherence to the ceasefire for 60 days. There's no enforcement mechanism and no binding guarantee of Israeli military withdrawal. Now, this seems pretty prohibitive. If there's no enforcement mechanism and no binding agreement of Israeli military withdrawal, like what are you even agreeing to in the first place? How could there be a ceasefire if you're not going to actually withdraw? Terms and exchanges, there's basically like how many captives, 10 living, 16 deceased, and there was a little bit different. Military withdrawal, Hamas agreed to Israeli withdrawal to March 2nd lines during the truce period. Full Israeli withdrawal from the entire Gaza Strip to take place immediately after a permanent ceasefire is declared and before the final exchanges of captives and bodies. What the U.S. and Israel crafted was only limited redeployments inside Gaza after the captive release, no commitment to full withdrawal, no return to pre-March 2nd positions. So in other words, anything we've done since we violated this first ceasefire, that's fair game. That's our territory now. I guess limited redeployments is good. But again, no full commitment to withdrawal. Humanitarian aid, Hamas agreed to immediate unrestricted aid flow under the January 17th humanitarian protocol. That means food, fuel, medicine, and construction equipment. Again, like I mentioned, the biggest threat that Israel sees. What the U.S. and Israel crafted, aid would enter immediately and the UN and Red Crescent would be involved in distribution. No mention of fuel, construction materials, or a total lifting of the Gaza blockade. No clarity on the future role of the controversial U.S. and Israeli-backed Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. Remember, these are the guys that oversaw this basically massacre of Palestinians on June 1st, the head of which has since resigned, I think even before the massacre took place. This is the part that's sort of the most interesting. The governance and reconstruction. What Hamas agreed to was the immediate handover of Gaza's administration to an independent Palestinian technocratic committee with full authority over governance and reconstruction, which would begin immediately. What the U.S. and Israel crafted, no mention of the Gaza governance and reconstruction. The day after may be discussed in future talks, but is not guaranteed. So that sounds to me like Hamas saying, we don't have to have a role in the future of Gaza. We can create a committee, but they have to be Palestinian. So that's the stipulation, is they should be a Palestinian committee, which again, send this and tell this to every liberal or everyone who ever tells you that, you know, Hamas has no future in Gaza, because they agree. They're like, okay, but Israel's mum on that, they don't want to talk about that. That seems pretty telling. I think the answer is they don't actually want any Palestinians in control. In fact, we know this because their goal has been the same since the beginning. They've always wanted an international, read American force on the ground to control Gaza, which again, an occupation. That's what they were floating under Biden. That's what they've continued to float under Trump. And I do think that Trump probably knows that is that's kind of a no-go for like his entire base. Like they're not going to like that. No one wants another occupation. Here's a discussion about this rejection, Israel's rejection of Hamas stepping aside in Gaza, that Ryan Grimm and Jeremy Scahill were sort of digging into earlier, I think today.
Sammy, in the original agreement between...
And this is Samuel Arian.
Sammy, in the original agreement between Witkoff and Hamas, there was a provision in it that said that Hamas would give up governance to a technocratic committee that would then oversee, governing and reconstruction. In the agreement that Witkoff then cut with the Israelis, that provision was stripped out. When Hamas, resubmitted its new conciliatory provision, they reinserted the provision that they would give up governance and authority over reconstruction to this technocratic committee. So what is happening here? Why is this a provision that Hamas is insisting on and that Israel continues to strip out?
Excellent observation. What's happening here is that Israel has always said, we don't want Hamas to rule Gaza. We don't want October 7th surprise to come again. And there is a lot of talk since the day one about the so-called day after. So Hamas came with this and said, okay, what is it that you want? We want you to be out of Gaza. You can't rule Gaza. So through the Egyptian mediation and months of negotiations, they came up with the idea, the Egyptians came up with the idea, which Hamas and the other resistance groups accepted, that Hamas will even though they are the elected party, they will move away from ruling Gaza, and that there will be a commission or a committee, which will be independent, technocratic, that will be given the task of taking care of Gaza in terms of ruling it and dispensing of all the affairs of Gaza. And the Israelis all along rejected that, because their idea is not to have any Palestinian in charge of Gaza. What they want, basically, two things. One is to reoccupy Gaza, take the land, or in the words of Trump, to make it Riviera of the Middle East. He's trying to look at this as a real state opportunity, where the Israelis want to bring back settlements in order to please their settler supporters. But also, more importantly for them, they found this to be an opportunity to solve their problem. And what is their problem? It's the demographic problem. Israel, after Oslo, had to choose 2 out of 3 things in order.
Okay, up until then, I think this is fascinating. So he's basically like, they never really wanted, I mean, the line was Hamas can't roll Gaza, and they're not even actually committed to that line as well. They just don't want Palestinians to be in control of their own future and their own fate. And again, that's the whole point. I mean, leaving aside the fact that Hamas was supported and inflated by the state of Israel, and the fact that if you study the Middle East, whether it is Gaza, Iraq, Iran, any country, pick a country in the Middle East, the subject of decades of colonialism and outside intervention, the name of the game has always been to kill the moderates. You always want to kill moderates who are willing to come to the table, to have discussions, because you only want 2 groups of people in order to control them. You want extremists so that you can say, look at how violent they are, they're crazy, you know, they do these evil things. Or you want complete capitulative, sort of stewards of your own occupation. And you could argue that Mahmoud Abbas in the West Bank has done exactly that and is very much controlled by Israel, and does not, represent, an actual like fight in him for the end of settlements, the liberation of Palestinians, any kind of 1 or 2 state solution. And so, tale as old as time, whenever there's hey, we'll come to the table, we'll do this thing. No. And the United States did this in Iraq, right? When we invaded, we said, we do not negotiate with terrorists. Anyone who was part of the Saddam Hussein regime is a terrorist. And we did the same thing in Afghanistan. What happened? Absolute lawlessness. It drove people to the extremes, and we were like, oh no, but we consider you a terrorist because you were part of this Ba'athist regime. Never mind the fact that the United States supported the Ba'athist party for years and years and years and years and supported Saddam Hussein's rise, and suddenly he's our enemy. So again, this is well-worn colonial mentality and territory. But let's see what Samuel Arian is saying about the demographic problem, which means effectively Israelis want to be in the majority. They don't want to have Palestinians have any kind of equal control.
Had to choose 2 out of 3 things in order to look at what would be the future of this region. They want it to be called a Jewish state. In other words, having Jewish majority. They want to call themselves a democratic state. And of course, what they mean by that is a Jewish democratic state, not democratic state for all the citizens. And the land. If they choose to be democratic and Jewish, that would have been the 2-state solution. 78% of historical Palestine is Israel and 22% the Palestinians. They didn't want to do that. So they always rejected that. So over the course of 32 years, the number of settlers went up from 125,000 in 1993. Today, they exceeded 800,000. And the person who's in charge of this settlement policy is Smotrich, who is saying day in and day out that we would like to bring, and this year he brought 22 new settlements. We want that number to become 1 million, and then we're going into our second million. If they had chosen to be democratic and keep all the land, that's a one-state solution that no Zionist party is accepting, because that would defeat the whole Zionist idea. So what they chose is the three things. They wanted to be called Jewish, they cannot be called democratic, and they want to keep the whole land. That meant an apartheid regime, which brought a problem for them, because the whole world cannot accept this over the long term. And indeed, even someone like President Carter, back in 2007, he wrote a book called Peace, Not Apartheid. Even John Kerry, in his waning days in December 2016, upon the election of Trump, he said he had an address in which he says we're going into an apartheid. The whole world was calling apartheid. The Israelis didn't know how to deal with this. October 7th came, and now they think that there is a fourth way, which is genocide, which is expulsion, mass expulsion. They can solve this demographic problem, and therefore they don't want any Palestinian to be in charge of Gaza. What they want is to expel as many Palestinians from Gaza. And if they can do that, then their next step is to expel as many Palestinians from the West Bank, thinking that they can get rid of their demographic problem. Now they can have the land, they can be called Jewish, they can be called democratic, and damn the Palestinians and damn the whole world.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, the fourth way, right? He's basically like, hey, October 7th was this opportunity, this opportunity to do just ethnic cleansing. Like, we wanted to do it with settlements. We wanted to do it with control. We wanted to do it with the Abraham Accords and sort of like slyly cutting out Palestinians from any kind of normalization of relations with other Middle East countries, which is in part why Hamas did what they did. And the fact that Palestinians were cut out of those negotiations, and peace was being actual peace was being put to the side. And now since October 7th, they're like, oh, perfect. This is a pretext. This is a pretext to, do genocide. And what's crazy and really disturbing about all of this, number one, it's like, can we just drop the pretense? Can we just drop the pretense that this line that Hamas has no place in Gaza? Like, the only people who are still using the line Hamas has no place in Gaza are Americans. Sorry. Like, they're American soft Zionists or real Zionists who support Israel, who don't pay attention to the amount of bloodshed and death that's happening. And they don't even pay attention to the things that are being said inside of Israel itself, or from people who, openly discuss this. And I want to, Haaretz had this actual report the other day, reported by Middle East Eye, but basically that nearly half of Israelis do support ethnically cleansing Palestinians in Gaza. Now, the headline is killing all of them, but the actual, I think it'd be more appropriate to call it, an ethnic cleansing or the removal, which is effectively ethnic cleansing. But in late March, Haaretz newspaper published, again, Israeli hard writers, they hate Haaretz, found that 82% of Israeli Jews support the forced expulsion of Palestinians from the Gaza Strip. 82%. 47% of Israeli Jews answered yes to the question, do you support the claim that the Israeli army in conquering an enemy city should act in a manner similar to the way the Israelites did when they conquered Jericho under the leadership of Joshua, i.e., to kill all of its inhabitants? The reference is to the biblical account of the conquest of Jericho, and 47% said yes. So that's where they get I'm sorry about misreading that. That's where they get the killing all Palestinians. Now, I don't know if asking someone about people interpret their religious texts differently. So like, I don't know if a 47%, approval is like, yeah, we support killing them, but 82% saying that they should be forcibly removed from Gaza is massive. And like, this is what a lot of us, when we talk about like just how extremist Israeli society is, this is what we talk, like, this is how we talk about it. And there need to be, I don't know if I already said the word off ramps, but I'm using it again. There need to be off ramps for a society that is this violent and this hateful and this okay with apartheid, ethnic cleansing. And I don't mean like, there was I can't remember who wrote this piece, but basically like there was an article, an op-ed in The Guardian that was like, there should be military intervention to protect the people of Gaza. I think that's a very fair thing to say. And his line of reasoning was effectively, the US and their involvement in Kosovo to protect citizens from Milosevic, which I know like someone like Chomsky has had sort of long-standing critiques of, but the point is there have been defensive humanitarian military operations to stop a regime from killing its own people and or other people. Like, that's been done. Now, of course, the United States is not going to do that, but that's very much, that's a perfectly fine plea, But I think the longer term question for me is like, if we actually had a real international body, if we actually had, peacekeeping troops, Israel Palestine is the number one place that one would deploy said troops. Like, that is where it is absolutely necessary. Look, it's one thing for politicians to say, we should put travel restrictions on settlers for if they want to come to the United States, or put, sanction. They're not sanctioning Israel, but, like, we're not going to let, if you're a settler in the West Bank, you're not going to be able to come to the United States. Like, that's nothing. That's like bullshit, right? Like, that's no policy. That's the weakest sauce thing you could possibly do. If what is actually happening, which is not just a genocide in Gaza, but, the violation of international law, you have to have some way to enforce that international law. And that would be, you gotta go. You gotta go. You can't just take other people's land. Bye. You can't just be here. But of course, it's supported, hand in glove, or slyly, not so slyly, by the Israeli military, the expansion of settlements. And if it's supported by the Israeli government, and if it's supported by the Israeli government, the Israeli military, it's supported by the US. What's going on, Frantifa? If you haven't already, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that button. And also, you can become a patron and support the show every single week. Get access to bonus episodes and exclusive merchandise. Patreon.com/Bitchuation Room. Do